Hi everyone, I'm Zuhur Balayah and I'm a doctoral student based at the Centre for Healthcare Innovation Research at City University of London. The research I'm presenting here today is on conceptualizing dimensions of implementation outcomes of healthcare innovations, and it's a systematic review and a concept analysis. Just to acknowledge support from the NIHR ARC, thanks for the support in my doctoral research. So what is implementation success? This is just a little thought experiment. If you notice what images or concepts that first come to mind when you try and imagine what is implementation success, it could be one thing, or it might be a number of things that are related in some ways. When we looked into the current literature, we found that there is a lot of variation in concepts that indicate success of implementation. Different terms are used. For example, on one hand, we have terms such as maintenance, sustainability, institutionalization, normalization that indicate deep implementation. On the other hand, we found terms such as discontinuation, abandonment, relapse that indicate shallow implementation. Other concepts are used also to indicate success of implementation outcomes, such as strength, intensity, degree, and quality of implementation. And in a recent scoping review that documented high heterogeneity in implementation outcomes and indicators, concluded the need to consider healthcare complexity and pragmatism to meet the challenges to achieving consensus in framing implementation outcomes and indicators. So this also resonates with calls for redefinitions of implementation success away from predetermined outcomes and process fidelity. And in some ways, there are some very recent attempts to produce combined matrix that integrates the implementation outcomes framework and the re-aim dimensions. And the authors of this work stated that the combined matrix offers additional guidance when evaluating later stages of scale-up activities. So why is it important to consider reconceptualizing domains of implementation outcomes? Well, it could be argued that the current conceptualization of implementation outcomes that are seen as indicators of implementation success might reflect a narrower focus. For example, it represents a state or a nominal rather than representing dynamic scaled outcome. For instance, constructs provided by the implementation outcome framework represents only two domains of implementation effectiveness or success, which are the adoption and implementation outcomes as one domain and sustainability outcomes as another. And this conceptualization could be seen to reflect a narrower focus in that it's not clear how phenomena such as abandonment, and de-implementation that could represent other domains of implementation outcomes fit under the implementation outcome framework classification. So the question that we're asking is, how are these other domains conceptually related to our conventional understanding of implementation outcomes? Also, it's not clear what the relationship between the magnitude of implementation outcomes and the magnitude of implementation progression is. In other words, in the literature, it's not clear how the implementation outcomes and quantification of the implementation progress are linked conceptually. So again, another question that we ask during the process of this systematic review is how these two dimensions as indicators of implementation success are linked conceptually. So our research question is around the need for a clearer conceptualization of the extent to which innovations are implemented successfully, to account for and understand other related concepts such as abandonment and de-implementation. So we sought to consolidate dimensions of implementation outcomes for embedding innovation. And we did this by synthesizing theoretic scientific literature from multiple disciplinary backgrounds. As a theoretical lens, we used Scarborough and Kratz's theoretical perspective on embedding innovation. And this was useful lens for us to use for examining what are the domains and dimensions of implementation that was not limited to, or that was not limited at the local or organizational level, but was also applicable to the system level or the scale up and spread efforts. This paper bridges two perspectives: diffusion perspective, which focuses on system level adoption, and implementation perspective, which often focuses on local post-adoption use. And if we look to the figure on the right, which I've taken it from this paper, shows conceptual positioning for embedding innovation. We can see the way the diffusion perspective and the implementation perspective are mapped together to conceptualize distinct dimensions of the innovation process. And this notion, embedding innovation, as illustrated on the top right of this diagram, is defined as representing a scenario showing how innovations are successfully implemented at scale. With regards to our methodology, we used pragmatic utility concept analysis by Morse and colleagues, which is a meta-analytic and interpretive method that provides new insights for partially mature concepts using literature as data source. The method can be used for different purposes, such as concept development, clarification, comparison, or correction. Our main reason for using it, though, was to clarify the concept of implementation depth, which is assessed as partially mature concept. Given that the concept's definitions or labeling, its characteristics, boundaries, preconditions, and outcomes are not clearly defined. And just to give a summary overview of what the difference is between a mature concept versus a partially mature concept based on Morse's criteria for concept evaluation, here on this table at the bottom half of the slide, we can see under criteria, the main features for assessing a concept maturity level is based on the level of clarity of the terms used to label the concept and its definitions. And an emerging concept would lack clarity and would have competing definitions, whereas a mature concept would be clear and conceptual. For the other features, which are the characteristics, preconditions, and outcomes and boundaries, for an emerging concept, these would not be identified and its boundaries are not known. Whereas a mature concept, the different aspects or features of the concept would be clearly defined and fully described. So partially mature concept fits somewhere between emerging and mature. And this is what we judge the concept of implementation depth to be, thus needing a clarification. The approach we use to search and select relevant literature is one from Booth and colleagues, which is termed as Behemoth. And that stands for behavior or phenomenon of interest, health context, exclusions, models, and theories. And this approach provides a structured way of identifying and specifying theory in a systematic review to derive the eligibility criteria and design the search strategy. This approach recommends combining three aspects, which are: one, behavior of interest, and in our case, this was implementation depth, and two, health context. And for us, we were interested in public or not-for-profit healthcare delivery or management. And three, models or theory, which for us meant including any studies developing or enhancing models, theories, framework, concepts, definitions, and measures about implementation. We run the search across 8 different databases from 2004 and 2020. We also included papers by hand searching references of selected publications, key textbooks in the field of implementation science and innovation research, as well as citation tracking for original concepts or theory papers that were used by the included publications. So what did we do after identifying tons and tons of publications? Well, this involved 3 main steps. The first step was about study screening and selection, and 3 members of our research team reviewed all the citations, one reviewer doing 100% and the other 2 reviewers each doing 50%. Second step was about organizing and structuring the literature we identified. This involved data extraction on study characteristics and aspects of the first order concepts. The aspects of the first order concepts that we were interested in extracting were the definitions and the characteristics or attributes and the boundaries or allied concepts, after which we then derived the second order concepts of implementation depth. The third step, which is the most interesting part of doing using a pragmatic utility concept analysis, is data analysis and synthesizing by asking key analytic questions of the literature. And the analytic questions we asked were about defining implementation depth and its attributes. And so we asked these questions. Number 1, what is implementation depth? And 2 was about the implementation depth. Is implementation depth an outcome or a process? And in number 3, we asked, is implementation depth a scale-based concept or an end status? The other main analytic questions that we asked was about boundaries and concepts of implementation depth. In other words, what concepts occur with the concept? This is our search results. So we identified 2,600 plus records from across the databases that we searched. And we identified another 260 records from the other sources. And we ended up including 232 studies before we removed all non-theory records. These 232 records included not only studies developing concepts or contributing to theory, but also studies either mentioning or applying, but not further developing concepts or theory. So in our last step, we only included studies either developing concepts or contributing to theory. And we ended up with 66 studies in this in the concept analysis. And so to make sense of all the first order concepts that we extracted from the included publications, we did this conceptual mapping of implementation depth, which is shown in the figure. And before I zoom in for a closer look, you will notice that there are two main subdivisions of implementation outcomes, which are conceptualized as dimensions of implementation depth. That are linked to the derived second order concepts termed as domains, which are further linked to the first order concepts, in other words, constructs, extracted from the publications included in the concept analysis. With regards to the other, to the number of studies developing each of the first order concepts categorized under each of these domains, there were 31 studies developing concepts under sustainability, 23 studies under assimilation, 8 studies conceptualized different terms related to de-implementation, and the least number of studies, which were 5 in number, conceptualized terms related to abandonment of an innovation. And we had 7 studies developing concepts under the last category of implementation progression. So now if we zoom in to show each of the first order concepts linked to the domains. First, we have sustainability, where we can see further links to constructs such as routinization, normalization, institutionalization, maintenance, and penetration. And if we take another example of constructs linked to the domains of assimilation, we have acceptability, appropriateness, adoption, fidelity, and so on. And the third and fourth domains of implementation that we included, we identified is de-implementation and abandonment. And one of the main conceptual difference between these two concepts is de-implementation is viewed as something that is active, something that is desired endpoint, whereas abandonment is associated with a passive process. And now at the bottom of the figure, we have the proximal outcomes that are linked to the implementation progression, what we term as stickiness. And the first order concepts under this category are implementation phases, stages, progress, sticky knowledge, stickiness, and sticky transfer. And these are terms extracted from the included publications. So this second figure, which I am about to show, and which we consider to still be preliminary as analysis still ongoing, shows consolidated conceptualization of implementation depth, which can be considered to show mapping dimensions of implementation outcomes to specify type and level of success for embedding innovation. So here at the x-axis of this 2x2 figure, we have one of the dimensions of implementation depth, which is depth of proximal implementation outcomes, which we term stickiness. And the depth of stickiness can be defined as quantification of implementation progression. On the y-axis, we have depth of distal implementation outcomes, which we term as embeddedness, which reflects the outcomes of implementation processes. And so now if we map the 4 different domains of implementation depth we identified onto these 2 dimensions, we first have abandonment. And here at the bottom left, which represents both shallow progression, stickiness, and shallow distal outcome, embeddedness. Next, we have the assimilation on the bottom right, which represents when there is a deep progression, stickiness of active implementation of the innovation, but shallow distal outcomes or shallow embeddedness. And next, we have the de-implementation on the top left. And de-implementation is about removal or reduction of an existing low-value practice. So the desired outcome for this would be shallow progression or stickiness, since the whole idea would be with de-implementation is to make a low-value practice to unstick. And at the same time, to also achieve deep de-implementation of distal outcomes or deep embeddedness of the implementation. And the fourth one, or the final one, is sustainability on the top right, which is about normalizing and sustaining innovations over time. So it represents deep depth of stickiness and deep embeddedness of the innovation. So in summary, the second order concepts of implementation depth can be seen to clarify a unified structure to conceptualize the dynamic successes or failures of implementation efforts. And this might be helpful in that it offers a useful heuristic for operationalizing shallow to deep implementation that could be better suited for understanding challenges for sustaining, scaling, and spreading healthcare innovations. And I stole this image on the right as the concept it shows struck me to be similar to that of implementation depth. It shows the concept of palette of being, the idea that everything is connected, an idea also at the center or at the core of science. These are the references I've cited during the talk for anybody that might be interested. And lastly, just to say thank you, and I look forward to taking questions and our discussion to follow on from this.